we are live.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to everyone. It's great to have our energy campers with us again for day 2 of the 2021 virtual energy camp. We hope that you enjoyed some of our demonstrations and virtual field trips today. We have our expert with us today, Ed Spears, who you heard in the video from today's virtual field trip. He's here to share his expertise with us and answer several of your questions. I'm sure several of you are wondering who our prize winners were from yesterday. So our prize winners from yesterday are Anika Natarajan and Srenika Mapidi are yesterday's prize winners. So congratulations to each of you. We will be reaching out to your parents and letting them know about your prizes and how we can get those prizes out to you. But thank you very much for chiming in yesterday. As a reminder, for anybody that's interested in being put into our drawings, all it takes is a picture of one of our demonstrations or at-home activities, or asking a question in our Q&A sessions like right now. So if you ask a question today in the comment section, you will be automatically entered into an opportunity to win one of these daily prizes. Or if you've done any of our at-home demonstrations, take a picture, have your parents send it to us or tweet it at us, and you will also be entered to win a prize. We love seeing those. We were glad to see the ones that we did yesterday and look forward to seeing some more. Now, to kick off today, just like we did yesterday, I'm gonna let the adults on the call right now have an opportunity at my dad joke of the day, energy-related dad joke of the day. So adults, be ready. Do you all know what wind turbines talk about? Nothing. They just shoot the breeze. There's your energy dad joke of the day. All right, and with that, because you all didn't come here to see me this afternoon, you came to hear from our experts. I am going to turn it over to Mr. Ed Spears right now, who can first tell you a little bit about himself and then what you learned in the video, and then please jump into the comment section to ask some questions. But Mr. Spears, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Evan, and I'm glad to be here. My name is Ed Spears, as Evan said, and I work at Eaton here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we make lots of high power related products right here in Raleigh and in other places around the globe. But we're participating along with some of our competitors and other folks that are in similar businesses in what we call a grid transition. And you may remember some of those topics from the video recorded portion that I narrated. And we talked about, for example, things like everything as a grid. Primarily, we're talking about the power grid or the spider web network that power gets from the local utility company to our homes and businesses. But there's other things that are grids as well. Your internet service comes to you via more or less of a grid. Your natural gas service, if your homes and kitchens are heated and cooked, and water heating and things like that via natural gas, that's supplied by a grid as well. But the electrical grid is the biggest and oldest and the one we depend on almost the most intimately to make sure that we can go through our day-to-day lives. On a day like this, you know what a disaster it would be to not have our air conditioners, for example, and that energy comes to us via the grid. But because it's old and it's always been done the same way for 100 years, we're finding now that we need to put some flexibility into the power grid and add to its reliability so power's on all the time, no matter what, even if there's a massive weather event and things like that. So we talked about those kind of things. We also talked a little bit about using renewable energy to supplant and to help the grid do its job even better. So what's renewable energy? Well, unlike oil and gas, it comes from where? Well, it comes from the fossils of dinosaurs that were buried hundreds of millions of years ago. And once we use that oil or gas, the only way to get it back is going to be to bury something and wait another 20 million years to renew that energy. Not very practical. So what's renewable energy? Well, it's things that we can use and reuse, like water, wind, solar farms, even water pressure in places like Canada, for example, when they call their local utility company, actually, instead of calling it a power company, they call it a hydro company, because a lot of their energy is generated via hydropower, water power. rather than using coal and gas and natural gas and that kind of thing. So we want to take advantage of the abilities we have today to use renewable energy to at least help with the regular energy that we receive via the grid. There's also the concept of energy storage. If we're going to use renewable energy, we want to be able to store the energy that we create and don't need right yet and have it available for when we really need it, like when there's a power outage, for example, or when there's an extremely hot day or extremely cold winter night, and we may need a little extra boost to the power that's already on the grid. I need to have stored energy ready to go for that. We also talked about microgrids, which is a small version of a big power grid that I might operate and own if I'm a campus type environment, like a hospital with multiple buildings that are all served from the same power supplies, or a university, or a industrial application, anywhere where they have multiple separate buildings, but they all need to share and use the same power. So they'll develop a miniature grid with multiple choices for where they get their power from. Normally it's from the utility company. Utility companies having a problem today, they can get some from some stored energy in batteries, or maybe from the solar farm on the roof, or the wind farm down the road. So those are examples of where a microgrid can become a very helpful thing, especially for users of a lot of power. Speaking of a lot of power, one of the biggest hogs on the grid, the electrical grid, as well as the water distribution grid, are data centers. The big computer facilities that house all the computers, that store all your Facebook and Instagram photographs, and basically support your online gaming functions and all that sort of thing. They suck down a lot of power, and we want to make sure we operate those things as efficiently as possible so that our cost to the environment, for example, stays reasonably low. Another example that's going to be coming up very soon, and you'll hear more about it, is the electric vehicle charging. We've got a lot of states and a lot of countries around the world that are committing to having a large fraction of their automobile and transportation services by electric vehicles. Now, that's great. I don't have to pay Exxon or Handy Hugos for my gas anymore if I have an electric car, but I do have to pay Duke Energy because I've got to recharge those vehicles, and that's typically done overnight. It can take a lot of energy, especially if I want to charge my vehicle fast. And by fast, I mean 10 or 15 minutes and not necessarily an 8-hour overnight charge like I might have on a car. So we talked about the kind of things we can use renewable energy and stored energy for electric vehicle charging support and make that an easier transition from gas-powered automotives and trucks and trains and all those kind of things to electric vehicles. So those are just a short list of the concepts we talked about, just to prod your memory a little bit there. But I think now we can open up to any and every question that you guys and gals may have. And if I don't know the answer, I'll either make something up or contact an expert that it then indeed does. So let's go ahead and open it up for, again, any question that you may have.
Our first question is, how much power do you get per day from wind farms?
Of course, it depends on the size of the wind farm. And by that, I mean, how many windmills do I have? And of course, how hard is the wind blowing? So it can vary. If we take the wind farms that you'll see if you happen to do some traveling, especially in the upper Midwest, from say Chicago over through the Dakotas and places like Wyoming and Utah and those states, they have a heavy presence, especially in rural areas, with thousands and thousands of big windmills. Not really the kind of thing we see that often right down here in North Carolina, but they're widely deployed and put into place both in other places in this country and around the world. So a big wind farm that covers, let's say, 100 acres could produce enough power to run a small community or a big subdivision, let's say with 60 or 100 homes for a day, just based on wind. Now, what happens when the wind stops blowing? Well, if I've got a battery backup, I can suck some power out of those batteries while I wait for the wind to pick up again. What if it doesn't pick up again? Well, I've always got the utility I can run on, but keep in mind that I can do these things, whether they're wind power or solar power, even if the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. How? Well, we know in some part of this great country, the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. Any point in time, if it's not windy or sunny here, it is somewhere else in another part of the country. So we use that power. Well, wait a minute. how do I get that power from California to Raleigh if I need it? And it's not sunny in Raleigh or it's not windy in Raleigh and my wind farm is not performing. Well, a very quick communication takes place with a grid operator in California and says, hey, we need some of your wind power. Send it over. Well, how long does it take to get here? How about 1/60th of a second? So instantly we could be using power generated by a wind farm in California or Texas or North Dakota if we needed to. So we don't depend on wind power 100% of the time to receive that kind of energy. We all work together. That's part of the reason a grid is so neat, is that I can get energy from a lot of different paths to me.
Our next question is, how many wind farms are there in the United States?
I would say that it's individual wind farms. And remember, some of them can be really small, 2 or 3 windmills. Others can have 500 or 1,000 windmills spread over a multiple square mile area. But I would say the total in this country on land is about 1,000 to 1,500 wind farms. And there are a few of them cropping up out in the ocean, off the coast of Massachusetts, for example, off of the coast of some of the other states that border the ocean, especially on the Atlantic side. They're putting up wind farms out there. Why are they doing that? Well, windmills tend to make a little bit of noise. There's new ones that are quieter. They're also big and they take up a lot of space, and not everybody wants to have a bunch of big old windmills on their property. So one possibility is to put them out in the ocean, not way out there, just a few miles out. And you know what? The wind is a lot steadier on that part of the area rather than you might find on land. So I would say there's probably only about 50 to 100 water-based wind farms around this country, but they're getting bigger and getting deployed faster as some of the challenges with that have been resolved. Like, how do I keep the windmill from rusting out there in the ocean? Those kind of things have been a challenge, but boy, the amount of power you can get out of a wind farm that's ocean-based is pretty dramatic.
Our next question is, how much do each windmill weigh?
Oh, wow. The big ones, and most of them are big, are very, very heavy. If I look at a windmill, I might see in the car as I drive past one, a lot of them have three vanes or 3 blades, if you will. And those blades can be almost as big as sometimes half the length of a football field. So they don't look that big until you get right close to them. You see, these things are huge. Now, they're made out of carbon fiber nowadays. And the good news there is that gives you a real strong fan blade for a very, very lightweight, a lot lighter weight than a metal fan blade would be. But you also have the tower that the windmill sits on. And that device has to be sturdy enough to handle a whole lot of wind and tornadoes and ice storms and all those kind of things that are going to occur while that thing is in service. And then at the top, the actual motor or the generator, excuse me, that takes the wind power from the blades and converts it into electrical energy, that's going to weigh quite a bit as well. So if I had to estimate an average windmill in a wind farm that's supporting, let's say, a local city, I would say that it probably weighs about 300 to 400 tons. So 2,000 pounds times 300 to 400 would give us an idea. Now, they're smaller windmills, and in fact, you may have noticed the one in the video was what they call a vertical windmill. It didn't have blades at all. It was more of a turbine-shaped device. It was like a vertical metal cylinder, and it was surrounded by a kind of a blue scaffold or framing area there. The good news there is they don't take up as much space either on the ground or in the air, and they're quieter, and they can generate a little more power than a traditional windmill, and they cost less, and they weigh less. So probably like a small one that would run an office building or a factory, for example, at least during windy days, would probably weigh only 15 to 20 tons. So there's a wide range of these windmills, but the big ones are truly huge.
That was great because you answered another one of our questions in the process, which was, are there different sizes of windmills? So we already went with that one. What if the wind is too fast? Does the turbine risk breaking in that situation?
Excellent question. I always wondered about that too until I consulted an expert. And the wind, it is possible if I just had a windmill up there like in the old days with a fixed set of windmill blades and a good strong wind came along, it is in fact possible to blow the whole thing over or to break off those blades. And obviously we can't have that happening. It costs too much to build these things. So if you've ever been on a propeller type aircraft, for example, or a propeller type airplane, if you watch those propellers, you'll notice that each of the blades on the propeller can not only turn normally, but they can also twist in their position. It's called feathering the blades. So when I'm operating my windmill, I can also turn the blades, not just rotating them like wheels on a car, but turning each blade in its socket so that if the wind gets really, really strong, the angle of the blade to the wind actually changes and minimizes and allows the wind to blow on by. It doesn't turn the windmill as fast, but it doesn't blow it over either. So that's called feathering the blades, and it's totally automatic. We watch the wind speed through those windmills, and up to a certain point, the more wind we've got, the faster we turn, the more power we generate, and we love it. But if there's a severe thunderstorm or maybe even a hurricane, for example, I don't want to be blowing over all my wind turbines or my windmills. So I'll feather those blades automatically and they'll still spin, but not nearly as fast, even though the wind is whipping. And then when it settles down, we turn the blades back to their original position. A good example of this is if you look up at your ceiling fan, the blades are not sitting there just horizontal, are they? They're at an angle. And if I turn the windmill in one direction, that angle of those blades forces cool air down onto me sitting underneath that ceiling fan. On the other hand, in the winter, I want to take the cool air from the floor and mix it with the warmer air in the ceiling, and I run the fan in reverse. And that obviously changes the angle of the blades, the air, and instead of blowing wind down, it pulls it up from the lower portions of the room. Same idea with a windmill. Turning those blades can adjust how much air and what direction that air goes.
You mentioned rust earlier as one of the original problems with offshore wind farms. Our next question is, what happens if a windmill gets rust on it?
That can certainly happen. And in the early days when they tried to do this, that was one of their big problems. The windmill would work well for a few months, maybe a year or so, and all of a sudden it would start slowing down and eventually it would stop or freeze, so to speak, because it literally rusted itself. You know, out there in the ocean, particularly, it's not just whether the windmill gets wet, it's the salt air is highly corrosive. So the first thing they did was they tried using different materials. And one of those things was the carbon fiber blades that I was talking about, which are not metal and much more unlikely to be impacted or to be corroded by the salt air. But there are parts of the windmill that have to be made of metal. So how do I coat them or protect them to make them more rust resistant? So there was a lot of technology that went into that, I would say in the 1990s and early 2000s, to make these types of windmills much less susceptible to corrosion. But that's something that constantly has to be monitored. So somebody has to go out to that offshore wind farm at least a couple times a month and do some visual inspection of all those windmills that may be spread out over several miles of ocean, and keep an eye on how much corrosion is occurring and seeing if something needs to be fixed or painted or replaced. So there is some maintenance that's ongoing for offshore wind farms. It wouldn't be necessarily needed for a wind farm on land.
Our next question is, how long do wind turbines last?
It depends, and that's one of the reasons we see those vertical windmills that we looked at in the video, because we're hoping that they'll last longer. How long do they typically last? Well, ones that we were making 20 years ago, we were unpleasantly surprised to see they lasted maybe only 8 or 10 years. That's a big investment for something that only lasts us 10 years. We were hoping for more like 20 years. Well, we also learned from those early experiences, and we made improvements to the materials and the technology and the generators inside and the structural part of them and the bearings, that allow the windmill to spin. And it was more expensive to build these newer designed windmills, but now we are getting close to 20 years and probably more from the more modern windmills. But keep in mind, the more modern windmills didn't get used until 2010, 2015, so they haven't been out there for 20 years yet. But based on the rate at which we're seeing the wear and tear on those windmills, it looks like we're going to get another 10, 15 years out of the newest ones. And the very newest ones that we install today are hoping for 20 to 30 years. So time will tell. And we learn stuff, usually the hard way, all through the process.
How big is the biggest wind turbine in the world?
I'm not sure the biggest in the world, but the biggest I've ever heard of is that one that I mentioned that had 3 blades on it. Each blade was about 50 yards or 150 feet long. So the diameter there would have been between 250 and 300 feet for that windmill. So really the diameter of the windmill itself was the size of a football field. So as you can imagine, that was an extremely tall windmill, and it generates a great deal of power even when it's turning relatively slowly. The only downside to that is it tends to make a pretty loud whooshing noise. That if I'm living on a farm within earshot of that, for example, I get pretty tired of hearing that sound 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So we also have to sometimes limit the speed of these big whopper windmills so that they don't irritate folks living nearby with the noise that they make.
Our next question is comparing wind energy to solar energy. They ask, are wind farms or solar farms more efficient?
Another good question. A few years ago, it was like everybody was concentrating on wind farms because, again, in certain parts of the country, the wind is more reliable than the sun was. In terms, you had more cloudy days that you couldn't really predict at the beginning. So a lot of emphasis on wind farms, and there still is. The other problem was in the early days, and by early days, I mean, say 20 years ago, quite frankly, solar cells just weren't efficient enough to be a great way to collect and generate energy. It was very fascinating to think that, hey, the sunlight is free. I can use these solar cells. I can deploy them all over the roof of my building. And by golly, I'll generate enough electricity to power all the night lights in this office building. Well, that's not a lot of power. Really need more power from solar cells. And over the last 10 years, as an industry, the technology has leapfrogged what we had back in the early 2000s to the point where solar cells are getting better and better, more and more rugged. They generate more energy per square foot of solar panel space on your roof, for example. And they're vastly improved to the point where if you look at the level of companies and customers that are investing money in renewable energy, there's a fair amount more emphasis on solar than there is on wind for right now. It may change, but right now, solar is the most promising of all.
Our next question pertains to manufacturing. They would like to know, where are windmills manufactured?
Well, we manufacture windmills here in the US. General Electric would be a company that is known for doing that type of thing. There's another big company in Sweden, the name escapes me at the moment, that makes windmills, both the blades and the generators, that take the energy from the blades turning and convert it into electrical power. So there's probably 5 or 10 large vendors of windmills, and they're all kind of wrestling with the technology to get the most efficient windmill and the most rugged windmill that'll last the longest and be able to be deployed for the least amount of money. And like we talked about before, I'd also like to have one that doesn't make so much noise. There was concern about the early windmills actually impacting or contacting birds and either injuring them or killing them. Is there a way with technology to make the birds avoid the windmills? In fact, there is. So those kind of things are starting to act as differentiators or comparison points between different companies. This windmill's quieter than that windmill. This windmill generates more energy at the same wind speed than somebody else's windmill. And that kind of thing changes over the years. The vendor of windmills or the manufacturer of windmills that's in the lead right now, in 5 years, probably won't be in the lead. There'll be somebody else that's even better that we can choose from. So I would say I don't have a total number of windmill manufacturers, but they are manufactured in various places around the world, Asia, Europe, and the US.
I'm guessing this is a historical question, but this next question is, who created windmills?
I wasn't around back then, so I don't know for sure. But I do know that very early on, when we started recognizing, when I say very early on, what is it? In the late 1700s and early 1800s, when we started to have a little bit of understanding of electricity, we realized that if we can create motion with a diesel engine on a generator or with wind, or even with, for example, river water power like they do up in Canada, that if I can turn something like a windmill underwater or in the air, I can actually generate electricity. So that would be when I would guess the first practical windmills were deployed. Now, before that, what was happening? They were using the motion created by windmills to pump water from their wells. Now, that didn't provide them with electricity, but by golly, they really needed water too. So that was another way to use the windmill, was to have it act as a pump that could produce water and be stored in tanks and things like that. And the more the wind blew, the more water they could get out of their wells without having to pump it by hand, which was a real drag, I'll tell you.
All right, our next question is, you talked about this briefly when we were talking about the blade designs, but somebody asks, how easy is it for a windmill to fall over?
Fortunately, the way the windmill is constructed, very tall and very thin with only 3 blades instead of, say, 20 blades, those kind of things make a stable windmill, or a windmill that's not moving, very difficult to fall over. It's really not that top heavy. However, when the wind is blowing, you're definitely putting pressure on the top section of that windmill, and the faster and harder the wind blows, the more pressure it is. So the vertical part of the windmill is actually made of very thick metal and is very strong. And actually, when they install it, is buried quite deeply into the ground so that it won't fall over under high wind condition. But as we mentioned before, if I've got a severe storm or a tornado happening, it could theoretically blow over a windmill anyway. So the best way to stop that from happening is to do that thing where we twist all 3 blades so that their smallest edge is facing into the wind, and it doesn't push on the windmill so hard, and you don't have a problem with it falling over. So we've had very good luck recently with these tall, slim, but very strong windmills. If you look at historical pictures of old windmills, you remember they were set up on a fairly wide base that tapered and got smaller as you went higher and higher. And the whole reason for doing that was to have as much stability or resistance to being blown over from exactly the same situation we're talking about here. So customers, our users, and people that live nearby don't want windmills to take up a whole lot of ground space. They might want to grow crops or use that land for something else. So we need windmills that have a relatively small footprint, if you will, but are still really, really strong and resistant to be blown over. And it's part of the technology.
Our next question is sort of a follow-up to that. You mentioned that most of the designs these days have 3 blades. Our next question is, can windmills have more than 3 blades?
They definitely can, and quite frankly, they'd be more efficient and produce more power. But we're back to that noise thing. If you happen to check it out with your maybe a fan you've got from the old days at home that you use when the air conditioner is out, you'll notice, if you have a couple of different ones, that the more blades that they have and the size of those blades generally corresponds to more noise. And it's one thing when I've got a fan that's got a blade that's a foot long. It's another thing when I've got a fan that's got blades that are 100 feet long. And so the noise, and also the wear and tear on things like the rotating parts of the windmill, the bearings and things like that, just like the bearings on your wheels on your car can wear out after 100,000 miles. And you don't drive your car 24/7, 365, but windmills usually turn, at least at some speed, all the time. So the more blades I have, the more weight I have on the bearings, and they become more expensive. And it ends up being more costly to build a 10-blade windmill than it would be to build a 3-blade windmill, and you can get almost the same amount of energy out of it.
Our next question is about geography. Would there be a difference between having a windmill in the desert or having a windmill in the ocean?
I think it depends a little bit on the climate, but I would say that both options are good. In the desert, you have the extreme high heat and the toughness of doing things like climbing up there and doing maintenance and things like that in that heat. Whereas on the ocean, on the other hand, you have the corrosion and the salt air and the rust and all those kind of things. So challenges in both cases. I do think that when we look at it from a cost standpoint, if I decide to put my windmill farm in the desert, somebody's got to buy the land and pay for that. If I want to put my windmill farm in the ocean, I can't just go out there and stake out a section of ocean. But on the other hand, I don't have to purchase that real estate either. I have to get approvals from the government, and that takes years in a lot of cases to designate a certain section of this part of the harbor, or more likely you're out in the ocean several miles, and have that be marked off or roped off, so to speak, so that people don't sail through there in speedboats and things like that, jet skis, et cetera, and basically reserve that area for wind farm use. But there's less cost to putting it on the water, but it's also more regulations and more forms you got to fill out and more planning that has to take place, and that takes a lot of time. And if I want to build a wind farm, I don't want to wait 10 years for it to get done. I'd like to do it this year and next year, if at all possible. And sometimes it just takes too long to get the proper permissions. So I say, you know what? I'm going to put it on land. I got a big empty area here. I can buy the land cheap. Let's do it that way. So the answer really is, well, it does depend.
Our next question is, are there brakes on windmills?
Actually, even though that's a possibility, and the early wind farms did have brakes so that they could slow them down so they wouldn't spin too fast and either wear themselves out or fall over, they found out that it worked a lot better to do that blade feathering thing, because brakes, as good as they are, as they operate, if the wind's still blowing, it's still going to be pushing hard on those blades, even though the brakes are holding that blade still, and it can actually cause the blades to break. Whereas if I can rotate those blades so that they present their narrowest sharp edge to the wind, then there's a lot less pressure on them. It turns out brakes aren't needed. On the other hand, if I'm doing maintenance on that windmill, you better believe there's a brake assembly up there that keeps that thing from turning while I'm working on it, because I don't want to get hit by those things. So in operation, they don't typically use brakes anymore, but there are safety brakes, like the emergency brake on your car that you pull up when you're parked on a steep hill, for example. Same idea. So there are mechanical ways, but we don't want to be using brakes frequently, because it would mean more maintenance and more cost.
Our next question is, are there any cases where there's too much energy generated, resulting in a power outage or a surge or something like that?
Yes, there absolutely can be, and that's a big part of what we were kind of talking about in the presentation. Was what if the wind's blowing real hard and real steady, and I'm generating more energy than I need? Well, I can always basically set the windmills to feather their blades so they don't create as much energy, but it's a shame to waste all that potential energy. So what a lot of folks do is they use some sort of energy storage. And most of the time, that's a huge box full of batteries, the size of 2 or 3 tractor trailer trucks would be a good example. So when I'm creating more energy than the grid needs at this moment, I don't waste that. I simply say, let's direct that energy into the batteries. And think of one of these big batteries as a big storage tank that's empty. So I can fill it up with extra energy until it reaches the top, and then have that available for when I need it later when the wind's not blowing. So for example, during the day when the wind is blowing hard in the afternoon, if I'm creating more energy than I need, I'm going to direct that energy into the battery, charge up that battery to the very tip top. Then when the battery's full, I'll stop charging it. But then 10 o'clock at night when the wind is stopped and there's a power outage, for example, how do I get energy out of my wind farm? I draw it off those batteries. And again, these are very large batteries, and typically the latest technology for lithium ion for lightweight and long service life. So the batteries will last a long time deployed, out in the ocean or the desert or in the field somewhere on a farm, for example. But that extra energy is usually stored somehow. There's other ways to store energy too. There's capacitors, and there's even the ability to store energy as potential energy in liquid. For example, let's say I've got a hydroelectric energy generator that's being powered by water flowing down from a river into a lake. And I want to store some of that energy. Well, how would I do that? It's water flowing into a lake. Do I stop it? Can I start it? Can I speed it up? Well, what I can do is set a bunch of big pumps that during the night when the power cost is low and nobody's using that much energy, I'm going to pump a few 100,000 gallons of water out of that lake to another smaller lake that's about maybe 1,000 feet higher in elevation. So it's way up the side of the mountain. There's another lake, and I'm going to pump a bunch of water during the middle of the night from my big lake at the base of the mountain to this little lake that's halfway up. So now I've got some available water that I can use later to drive that hydroelectric windmill, or water mill is a better term, using water from that upper lake. So water flows downhill, right? So I use some of that to generate energy. So I'm actually using that upper lake at the higher elevation as a method to store energy that's not electrical or really mechanical at all, other than the water mill, or the call it an underwater windmill that actually converts that water flow into electrical energy. But in the absence of that kind of geography and water and river availability, batteries are usually the best way to go. Another choice, for example, would be ice, air conditioning for a big, big building. I saw a few of these back in the 1980s where they had a big building that used a lot of air conditioning and a lot of power to run that air conditioning. So what they did is they had another smaller building that's about the size of maybe 3 residential homes. And it was just one huge room that they filled up with ice. During the evening, they basically pumped this building full of water and used electricity to freeze that entire building. It was 20, 30 feet tall and 150 feet wide, and it was just one huge block of ice. And then during the day, when it got hot, what they do with that ice? They used it to help with their air conditioning needs for the larger building that they were servicing right next door. And that way, they didn't have to use as much power during the day when power is expensive. And then at night, when power was cheap, they pumped water back into that building, froze it all up, and had a big block of ice ready for the next day. That was a huge example of using ice for energy storage.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions. Our first one is a 2-parter. First, how tall are windmills? And also, sorry, I'm trying to find it. How long is the base of a windmill in feet? So like both height, size of the base. And then the second part of that question is, are you able to put solar panels on windmills to sort of do both?
That is a cool question. To take the first part first, I would say that the tallest windmills would be around 200 to 250 feet tall, which is pretty doggone tall. But again, there's a lot of smaller windmills as well. But if I take a typical windmill that's being used to supply power to support, let's say, a small town or even a small city, along with a bunch of other windmills, I would say that guy is probably about 150 feet tall. And down at the base, it's a relatively slim vertical shaft for that windmill. It's probably only about 25 to 30 feet square. So think of a big cement pad, like a patio, with the bottom of the windmill sitting on it. And it also, by the way, also protrudes underground to provide extra strength. But the base is about 25 feet by 25 feet. So doesn't really take up a lot of space to put in a really big, really tall windmill. Now, using solar panels on the blades, that's something that was actually thought about and deployed early on. In other words, they tried this and it worked fairly well. But one of the things that was true about solar panels back then is you needed a lot of area of solar panels in order to generate a decent amount of power. So while I might have really big blades on a windmill, it wasn't enough to really generate a lot of solar power compared to the amount of energy I was getting just from the wind. So they kind of scrapped that idea and went back to just plain old blades. However, today, the best solar panels out there can produce a lot more energy in a lot smaller space. So I wouldn't be surprised to see windmills developed and put into use that do have some solar panels mounted either on the blades themselves or maybe even one large solar panel at the top just to handle things like electrical needs for the windmill itself or communication capabilities. You know, as you can imagine, if I've got a nice tall tower with a windmill on it, I'm probably going to want to throw a few cell phone antennas up there so I can support the cell phone network for AT&T or T-Mobile or whoever. So I need a little bit of power to do that. And I could draw it off the windmill, but what if the windmill's not turning because there's no wind? Well, I probably got at least some light. Maybe it's not blazing sunshine. So solar panels on the blades or solar panels just mounted on the top of the windmill could perform that function. And you can bet that's something that's being considered by the vendors of these type of products.
Okay, and our very last question today is, what would the world be like if there were no wind farms?
I think we'd be in a situation where our power costs are considerably higher. What that means is if I don't have the ability to do wind farms or solar farms or both, then I'm going to have to get that power from somewhere. And the traditional way to do that was to build nuclear plants or coal-fired power plants or natural gas-fired power plants. And natural gas and coal power plants cost hundreds of millions of dollars just to serve. If I need to put in an extra power plant just to serve a small city or a big town, that's a lot of extra money. Who pays that money? Well, you and me that pay our electric bill every month. If it's a nuclear power plant, it's very, very hard to get that up and running and get all the approvals necessary. And they cost $2 or $3 billion and take at least a decade to build. So if we didn't have solar and wind power, we'd be having to do it the old-fashioned way, which is pretty inefficient, quite expensive, and even conceivably dangerous if there were a problem at a nuclear plant or even a problem at a natural gas plant. Could cause some significant environmental problems. And the same thing with coal. So we'd have an environmental issue if we didn't have wind and solar power by having to build so many new power plants to keep up with our demand. And we'd also have an issue of cost to support all this extra conventional power. And remember, that's non-renewable energy. Your coal and your natural gas, non-renewable. The only way to get it back is to wait for some organic matter that you buried 20 million years ago to turn into oil. And I can pump it out and use it again. But that's a pretty slow process compared with wind or solar.
Well, with that, Mr. Spears, we can't thank you enough for joining us this afternoon and also sharing your expertise and video with us this morning. I heard a lot of great questions, and so I just love the engagement and the thought process of our participants. So very excited to hear and see everything this afternoon. So my gratitude to you for joining us.
I certainly enjoyed it. Thank you for the opportunity. Let's do it again sometime.
Sounds great. All right, and so for our participants that were with us this afternoon, if you asked a question, you're being automatically entered into our drawing, which I'll announce tomorrow. Speaking of tomorrow, we will have a virtual tour and a live Q&A about our landfills and how we can use gas from our landfills to turn into energy. So be on the lookout for tomorrow's activities, tomorrow's virtual field trip, and then we will be live again at 4 o'clock. Wish everybody a wonderful evening and take care.
And that's a wrap.